The box arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in plain brown paper with no ribbon, no wax seal, no name. Emma stood in the hallway of Ashford House and stared at it for a long moment before she picked it up. It was lighter than she expected. She carried it to her room, closed the door behind her, and set it on the bed. The string came undone easily, too easily, as if whoever had tied it hadn't really cared whether it stayed closed or not. Inside was a dress. Black, heavy silk, the kind worn to funerals, to grief, to long seasons of sorrow. She lifted it carefully. The fabric pooled over her hands like dark water. It was beautiful in a cold sort of way. But as she held it up to the light, she saw it, a faint wear at the left elbow, a small, careful mend at the hem, done in thread that almost matched but didn't quite. The ghost of a perfume that wasn't hers. This dress had been worn before, by someone else. She already knew who. There was a card at the bottom of the box. No envelope. Just a small white card, the handwriting elegant and unhurried, as if the person writing it had enjoyed every stroke of the pen. "So you'll know your place." Emma read it once. Then she read it again. She set the card down on the bed beside the dress. She smoothed the fabric with both hands, slowly, the way you smooth a wrinkle you know will come back. Then she walked to her wardrobe, hung the dress inside, and went down to breakfast. She didn't say a word to anyone. Emma Voss had never been under any illusion about why she was engaged to the Duke of Ashford. It was not her beauty, though she was not unbeautiful. It was not her wit, though she had plenty of it, more than most people in Edmund Ashford's circle ever noticed, because Emma had learned very early that a woman who speaks too cleverly in the wrong room is quickly made to feel she has done something wrong. It was her name. The Voss name was old, older than the Ashfords, older than half the families in England who thought themselves important. Her great-grandfather had been an earl. Her grandfather had been an earl. Her father had been a problem. Lord George Voss had many fine qualities. He was charming at dinner, generous with port, and genuinely loved by his dogs. He was also, unfortunately, ruinous with money. Not in a dramatic way. There was no single catastrophic night, no one infamous card game that finished him. It was quieter than that, slower, a steady, gentle leak that took 20 years to empty everything out. By the time Emma was 22, the Voss estate was heavily mortgaged, the London house had been let, and her father had developed the particular kind of optimism that only men with no remaining options seemed to possess. The Ashford arrangement had been his solution. Edmund Ashford was 31, unmarried, and in possession of a title, 3 estates, and more money than he would ever reasonably need. He required a wife of good family. Emma's family was nothing if not good, on paper at least. The negotiation had taken less than a fortnight. Emma had been consulted at the very end, briefly, in the way one consults furniture about which room it would prefer to be placed in. She had said yes. What else was there to say? She had met Edmund 3 times before the engagement was announced. He was tall, dark-haired, and not unkind. She wanted to be fair about that. He held doors. He remembered to ask after her father's health. He did not speak over her, which already put him ahead of most men she knew, but he did not see her. That was the only way Emma could describe it. When Edmund looked at her, his eyes were polite and pleasant and entirely empty of curiosity. She was a checkbox, a solved problem, an arrangement that had been made and could now be filed away while he attended to more interesting things. Emma understood this. She did not like it, but she understood it. What she had not fully understood, not at first, was Vivienne. Vivienne hardly appeared at the second dinner Emma attended as Edmund's fiancée. She arrived late, which in any other woman would have been a social error. On Vivienne, it seemed intentional. She was dark-haired, bright-eyed, and wore red in a room full of pastels with the confidence of someone who had never once in her life wondered whether she belonged. Edmund's face changed when Vivienne walked in. It was subtle. If Emma hadn't been watching, and Emma was always watching, she might have missed it. A small shift, a loosening. The way a man's shoulders drop when he finally walks through his own front door. An old friend, someone murmured beside Emma. They grew up near one another. Emma had nodded and smiled and reached for her wine glass. She had filed that away too. Over the weeks that followed, Vivienne was simply always there. At dinners, at afternoon calls, at the small gatherings that filled Edmund's social calendar. Always perfectly positioned. Always warmly welcomed. Always finding a reason to touch Edmund's arm when she laughed, to lean close when she spoke, to catch his eye across a room. And Edmund let her. Not obviously, not in any way that could be named or complained about, nothing scandalous, nothing that could be pointed to and called what it was, but Emma saw it. She saw it and she said nothing and she smiled, and she was pleasant to everyone including Vivienne, and she went home each evening and sat in her quiet room and thought very carefully about what kind of woman she intended to be. She had not yet decided whether to fight. She had not yet decided whether Edmund Ashford was worth fighting for. And then the box arrived. And the dress. And the card in Vivienne's handwriting, with its 4 small words written so calmly, so confidently, as if the matter were already settled. So you'll know your place. Emma opened her wardrobe that evening and looked at the dress hanging there in the dark. She thought about sending it back. She thought about burning it. She thought about leaving it on Vivienne's doorstep in the middle of the night with no card at all, just the dress, returned quietly, so that Vivienne would wake up and understand that Emma Voss was not so easily put in her place. But then she thought about something else. The Duchess of Ashford, Edmund's mother, Margaret, was ill, had been ill for 2 months now, though no one spoke of it directly. It was the kind of illness that moved in one direction only. Everyone in Edmund's circle knew it. Everyone was already wearing careful expressions and speaking in careful voices and preparing in that quiet English way for what was coming. There would be a funeral, and Emma would be expected to attend. In black. She looked at the dress for a long time. Then she closed the wardrobe, went to her writing desk, and began a letter to her dressmaker, not to order something new, but to ask about alterations. The dress would need to be taken in at the waist. Emma intended to wear it well. There are women who enter a room and fill it, not with noise, with presence. The kind of presence that rearranges everything around it without appearing to try. Vivienne Hartley was that kind of woman. Emma had studied her carefully over the weeks, the way you study something you know might hurt you, with attention, with distance, with the particular discipline of someone who has learned not to show their hand too early. Vivienne was not cruel in any way that could be proven. That was the thing Emma kept coming back to. There was nothing she could point to, nothing she could name and hold up to the light and say, "There, you see, that is the damage." Vivienne was always smiling, always warm, always the first to compliment Emma's dress, her hair, the quiet way she arranged flowers at Ashford House when she visited. "How clever," Vivienne would say, tilting her head, looking at the flowers with genuine seeming admiration. "I never would have thought to put those 2 colors together." And then she would look at Emma with those bright, dark eyes, and there was something in the look, something small and quick, gone before you could be sure you'd seen it, that said, "I know exactly what I'm doing, and so do you, and neither of us is going to say so." Emma always smiled back. It was exhausting. The worst of it was not the public moments. The worst of it was the drawing room at Ashford House on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, when Emma arrived for tea and found Vivienne already there, already seated in the chair closest to Edmund, already laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting on the armrest of his chair with a familiarity that no woman with honest intentions rests her hand anywhere. Edmund stood when Emma entered. He was always correct about that. He crossed the room, took her hand briefly, said her name, but his eyes went back to Vivienne. They always went back to Vivienne. Emma sat down. She accepted her tea. She participated in the conversation with everything she had, her intelligence, her composure, her careful, precise ability to be interesting without being threatening, engaging without being loud. She was good at this. She had been good at this since she was 16 years old, and her father had started bringing her to dinners where she was expected to be ornamental and useful simultaneously. And still, Still, there were moments when Edmund would say something, a reference to a place, a memory, a name, and Vivienne would laugh in a way that contained a whole history. "We were there," that laugh said. "You weren't." And Edmund would laugh too, and for just a second the room would shrink down to just the two of them, and Emma would be sitting slightly outside of it, holding her teacup, perfectly composed, entirely invisible. She began to understand certain things about Edmund during those weeks. He was not a bad man. She held on to that. It mattered. He was not deliberately unkind, not cold by nature, not the sort of man who enjoyed the power of his position over women who had less. He had simply, and this was worse, in some ways, never truly examined the arrangement he'd made. It had been put to him as a practical necessity and he had accepted it as such, and somewhere in the back of his mind he had placed Emma in a category and moved on, and Vivienne existed in an entirely different category, a warmer one that had been furnished over years and couldn't simply be rearranged because a contract had been signed. Emma understood this. She did not forgive it, but she understood it. What she could not understand, what kept her awake some nights in a way she refused to admit even to herself, was what Vivienne wanted. Because Vivienne was not stupid, Vivienne knew exactly where the line was and how close she could stand to it without crossing it. She was not trying to publicly ruin Emma. She was not trying to break the engagement through scandal or confrontation. She was doing something more patient than that, something more calculated. She was simply making Emma feel small, quietly, consistently, in ways that left no bruise. "You'll grow into Ashford House," she said once, standing beside Emma at a window overlooking the grounds. Her voice was kind. Her tone was the tone of someone offering encouragement to a child on their first day of school. It takes time to feel at home somewhere this grand. Emma had looked out at the grounds, the formal gardens, the long gravel drive, the ancient oaks at the far edge of the property, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, pleasantly, "My family's estate in Wiltshire was larger." She felt Vivienne glance at her sideways. "Of course," Vivienne said, still smiling. "Of course it was." That was the last time Vivienne was careless. After that, the small cruelties were more careful, more deniable. A comment about the way Emma held her fork. "Oh, it's just a country habit, isn't it? Everyone in Wiltshire does it differently," made in front of 3 women whose opinions would be quietly circulated. A story told at dinner that positioned Emma as the punchline without technically naming her. A gentle, sympathetic observation to Edmund overheard by Emma, almost certainly intended to be overheard, about how difficult it must be for her, coming into all of this so late, with so little preparation. Edmund had nodded. He hadn't understood that it was a knife. He thought it was concern. Emma had stood in the hallway outside the study door and breathed slowly through her nose and did not cry, because crying was something she had decided not to do in this house. Not yet. Not until she had decided what she was actually going to do. And then the box had arrived. The dress. The card. "So you'll know your place." And something in Emma had gone very still. Not angry, she was past the first wave of anger by then, past the heat of it. This was something colder and much more useful. This was clarity. This was the moment a woman stops asking whether she should fight and starts asking how, because Vivienne had made a mistake. Not a large one, not a visible one, but Emma had been watching carefully for long enough to recognize it. Vivienne was not afraid of Emma, and that was the mistake. Every advantage Emma had: her composure, her intelligence, her absolute refusal to be rattled in public, the old quiet dignity that no amount of debt could take from a vase, Vivienne had dismissed as weakness, as passivity, as the docile acceptance of a woman who didn't know what else to do. Vivienne thought Emma was enduring this. She did not realize Emma was preparing. The dress hung in the wardrobe. Black silk, worn elbows, another woman's perfume still faint in the fabric. Emma had already written to her dressmaker. She had already decided. The Duchess of Ashford was dying. And Emma Voss was going to attend that funeral dressed impeccably, composed completely, and wearing every inch of Vivienne Hartley's mistake like it had been made for her. Margaret Ashford did not die quietly. Not in the way people mean when they say that, not with struggle, not with pain. She died the way she had lived, with full awareness of everything happening around her, with opinions about all of it, and with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had spent 64 years refusing to be managed by anyone. She lasted 3 weeks longer than the doctors predicted. Edmund spent those weeks moving between his mother's rooms and his study, with the tight, careful expression of a man holding himself together through sheer discipline. Emma saw him at dinners twice during that period. He was courteous. He was distant. He looked like a man standing in a corridor waiting for a door to open, not knowing what would be on the other side. She felt something for him during those weeks. She was honest enough to admit that. Not love, she did not know Edmund well enough for love, and she was too clear-eyed to confuse sympathy with something warmer. But something. A small, genuine tenderness for the boy she could see underneath the Duke, the boy who had clearly loved his mother and was now losing her and didn't know how to carry that in public. She did not tell him this. It wasn't her place, or rather, it should have been her place as his fiancée, but they had never built the kind of closeness that would have made such a thing natural. So she said nothing, and she was simply present when she was supposed to be present, and she gave him the space she sensed he needed. Vivienne, of course, was also present. More present than was strictly necessary. More present than was strictly appropriate. Emma noticed. She always noticed. But during those weeks she let it pass without her usual careful cataloging, because Margaret Ashford was dying, and it seemed wrong to spend those days thinking about strategy. Margaret died on a Thursday morning in November. By Friday, the black-edged announcements had gone out. By Saturday, the house was full of flowers and visitors, and the particular heavy silence of a great house in mourning. The funeral was set for the following Wednesday. Emma went home to her father's rented house in Kensington and sat in her room and allowed herself, finally, to open the wardrobe. She took the dress out and laid it on the bed. In the gray November light, it looked different than it had the morning it arrived. Less like an insult, more like an object, a piece of fabric, nothing more. She ran her hands along the fabric slowly, examining it the way her mother had taught her to examine things, not with feeling first, but with eyes. The silk was good quality, expensive once. The black had held well, no fading at the back or the sleeves the way cheaper fabric faded. The construction was excellent. She could see the hand stitching at the seams, the kind of careful work that cost real money and took real time. Vivienne had spent a great deal on this dress. And then she had worn it until it showed wear at the elbows, and then she had sent it to Emma. Emma thought about that for a long time. She thought about what it meant, not just the cruelty of it, but the specific shape of the cruelty. Vivienne hadn't sent something cheap. She hadn't sent something ugly. She had sent something that had been hers, that still carried traces of her perfume, her wear, her shape in the fabric, and she had wrapped it in plain paper with no ceremony, and sent it to Edmund's fiancée as though Emma were the sort of woman who ought to be grateful for another woman's cast-offs. So you'll know your place. Your place is below me. Your place is what I've already finished with. Your place is to receive what I no longer want and wear it and be thankful. Emma folded her hands in her lap and looked at the dress. She thought about her dressmaker's response to her letter. Mrs. Holt had written back within a day. She always did. She was the most reliable woman in London, confirming that yes, the alterations were entirely possible. Yes, Wednesday was achievable. And yes, she understood the assignment completely, though she would not have used those words. Take it in at the waist. Let out the hem by half an inch. Emma was slightly taller than Vivienne. She had noticed this. She had filed it away. Replace the buttons. The originals were good, but Emma had a set of jet buttons from her mother's old mourning dress, and they were better. Add a small velvet trim at the collar. Nothing extravagant, nothing that announced itself. Just enough. Just enough to make it unmistakably hers. She had thought very carefully about whether this was the right decision. Not morally, she was past weighing the moral dimensions of this particular battle, but strategically, practically, because Emma did not make moves without understanding what she was risking. The risk was this: Vivienne would know. The moment Vivienne saw that dress walk into the funeral, her dress, unmistakably, the fabric and the cut, and the specific shade of black that she had chosen 2 seasons ago at a dressmaker on Bond Street, she would know that Emma had received the package, had understood the message, and had chosen this response. And Emma did not yet know what Vivienne would do with that knowledge. But she had thought about it. She had thought about it for days, turning it over, examining it from every angle. And she had decided that this was worth doing for one specific reason, because no one else would know. That was the elegant part of it, the part that had come to her quietly, in the middle of one sleepless night, and settled into place with a small, certain click. The other mourners would see a young woman dressed appropriately, impeccably, in expensive black silk. They would see Edmund Ashford's fiancée conducting herself with exactly the dignity her position required. They would see nothing unusual. Only Vivienne would understand what she was looking at, and Vivienne could not say a word. To say anything, to pull Edmund aside and explain that the dress Emma was wearing was actually hers, that she had sent it, that the reason she had sent it was, she couldn't finish that sentence without finishing all the other sentences that came with it. She could not explain the dress without explaining the card. She could not explain the card without explaining everything it revealed about her. She was trapped. Emma had trapped her with her own trap. She picked up the dress, folded it carefully, and set it in her bag for Mrs. Holt. Then she sat at her writing desk and wrote a brief, correct, appropriately sorrowful note to Edmund expressing her condolences on the loss of his mother and confirming her attendance at Wednesday's service. She sealed it. She addressed it. Then she paused. She had met the Duchess of Ashford only 4 times. Margaret had been sharp-eyed and direct, the kind of woman who asked questions that made you feel she already knew the answers and was simply checking whether you would tell the truth. Emma had liked her immediately, which surprised her, because she had not expected to like anyone in Edmund's world. The last time she had seen Margaret, 3 weeks ago, briefly, when Emma had come to Ashford House and been permitted a short visit, the old woman had looked at her for a long moment from her bed and said something unexpected. "You're stronger than he knows." Emma had not known what to say. "He'll figure it out," Margaret had added, closing her eyes. "He's slow about these things. All Ashford men are, but they get there eventually." Then she had asked for her tea and the moment had passed. Emma had thought about those words every day since. She picked up her pen again, looked at the sealed letter and set it aside. She would deliver it tomorrow. Tonight she was going to sit with the quiet and think about a woman she had barely known who had seen her clearly when almost no one else bothered to look. The dress came back from Mrs. Holt on Tuesday evening. Emma unwrapped it slowly. The alterations were perfect. The waist was hers now, the hem fell exactly right, the jet buttons caught the lamplight with a quiet, serious gleam. The velvet trim at the collar was understated and exactly correct. She held it against herself in front of the mirror. She looked like a woman in mourning. She looked like a woman who belonged. She hung it back in the wardrobe and went to bed and slept, for the first time in weeks, without difficulty. Tomorrow was Wednesday. The morning of the funeral was cold and white. Not gray-white. The kind of November sky that isn't quite cloud and isn't quite light, that sits over London like a held breath, neither threatening rain nor promising anything better. The trees along the Ashford House drive had lost their leaves. The gravel was pale with frost. Everything was still. Emma arrived exactly on time. Not early, early would have looked eager. Not late, late would have looked careless. She stepped out of the carriage at the precise moment that suggested a woman who understood protocol completely and felt entirely comfortable within it. She was wearing the dress. Her maid had dressed her hair simply, no elaborate arrangement, nothing that competed with the occasion. A small black hat, her mother's pearl earrings, gloves that fit perfectly. She had stood in front of the mirror that morning for exactly as long as necessary and then looked away, because the point was not to admire herself. The point was to be ready. The entrance hall of Ashford House was already full when she arrived. Black everywhere, black wool, black silk, black crepe, the particular London version of collective grief that was also, unmistakably, a social occasion. Voices were low. Faces were arranged. Footmen moved through the crowd with the careful efficiency of people who had been briefed thoroughly and would not make errors today. Emma moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms, with composure, with attention, pausing to greet the people she knew, accepting condolences on Edmund's behalf with the quiet correctness of a woman who understood her role here. She was looking for Vivienne. She did not appear to be looking for Vivienne. That was the important part. She had been in the room perhaps 4 minutes when she found her, or rather, when Vivienne found her. Because Vivienne, Emma had come to understand, always positioned herself so that encounters appeared accidental. She materialized at Emma's left shoulder with the practiced naturalness of someone who had choreographed the moment in advance. Emma, her voice was warm, her expression was perfectly calibrated grief. "How are you holding up?" Emma turned. She watched it happen. She watched Vivienne's eyes travel down, just for a fraction of a second, the automatic inventory that fashionable women performed on each other, so habitual it was almost unconscious. She watched those eyes reach the dress. She watched the smile stop. Not disappear, Vivienne was too controlled for that. It simply stopped moving, froze in place, still technically present but no longer connected to anything underneath it. Her eyes came back up to Emma's face, and there was something in them that had not been there a moment ago. Recognition, and beneath the recognition, something that took Emma a half-second to identify: fear. Not large fear, not dramatic fear. A small, cold, precise fear. The fear of a woman who has just realized that the person standing in front of her is not who she thought she was dealing with. "I'm well, thank you," Emma said pleasantly. "It's a difficult day for everyone." "Yes," Vivienne said. "Yes, it is." A beat of silence passed between them. It lasted less than 2 seconds and contained an entire conversation. Then someone spoke to Vivienne from her other side and she turned away, and Emma moved on, and that was all. That was enough. Emma found her place in the procession and stood with her hands folded and her face composed and felt, running quietly beneath everything like a current under ice, a deep and private satisfaction. The service itself was long. The family's rector spoke first, a gentle, thorough man who had clearly known Margaret Ashford for decades and spoke of her with the specific affection of someone who had argued with her regularly and loved her for it. He described a woman of strong opinions, strong faith, and stronger loyalty. A woman who had run 3 estates during her husband's long illness without complaint and without error. A woman who had raised her son alone from the age of 12 and considered it the most important work of her life. Emma listened carefully. She was hearing, for the first time, a full picture of the woman who had looked at her from a sickbed and said, "You're stronger than he knows." She felt something shift in her chest, something she hadn't expected. Edmund spoke next. He had written his words down. She could see the paper in his hand, though he barely looked at it. His voice was controlled, and even the voice of a man who had decided that composure was the last thing he could give his mother in public. He spoke about her directness, her humor, her absolute refusal to offer comfort she didn't mean. He said she had been the most honest person he had ever known. His voice caught briefly on that last sentence. Just once. He recovered immediately. Emma watched him and understood something she had been turning over for weeks without quite articulating. Edmund Ashford was not an unfeeling man. He was an avoidant one. There was a difference. He did not lack the capacity for depth. She could see the depth in him right now, raw and real and visible in the way he held himself at that podium. He lacked the habit of applying it. He had learned, somewhere along the way, to manage his life from a careful distance, to keep the practical things practical and the emotional things filed away where they wouldn't create complications. His mother had apparently not taught him that. Perhaps she had spent years trying to undo it. After the service came the reception, the long, slow ritual of food and condolence and careful conversation that follows every grand funeral. Emma moved through it steadily, doing exactly what she was there to do, saying the right things to the right people, making sure she was visible but not intrusive. She was standing near the window, cup of tea in hand, when Edmund appeared beside her. He didn't say anything at first. He stood with her at the window and looked out at the garden, bare, November stripped, the rose beds cut back to their thorns. "She liked you," he said finally. Emma turned slightly. "I beg your pardon." "My mother," he was still looking at the garden, "she mentioned you. Several times toward the end." A pause. "She didn't mention most people." Emma looked back at the garden. "I liked her," she said. "I didn't know her well, but what I knew I liked." Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then, and Emma would think about this later, would turn it over many times, he looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the polite, surface glance she had become accustomed to, the one that registered her presence and moved on. This was different. This was the look of a man noticing, for the first time, that something is standing directly in front of him. His gaze moved over her face, then briefly downward over the dress. Something crossed his expression. Not recognition, not quite. He wouldn't know Vivienne's dress. He wouldn't have catalogued it the way Vivienne had. But something. "That's a striking dress," he said. "Thank you," said Emma. "It was a gift." He looked at her for another moment. "You look well in black," he said. It came out sounding like he surprised himself with it. "Most Voss women do," Emma said pleasantly. "We've had a great deal of practice." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The occasion didn't permit smiling, but the possibility of one. The ghost of it. Then someone called his name from across the room and he excused himself and was gone. Emma turned back to the window. Her tea had gone cold. She drank it anyway. She was thinking about what Edmund had said. "She mentioned you several times toward the end," and what it meant, and whether there was more to it, when one of the household staff approached her quietly and said that there was something in the late Duchess's study that had been left for her. "For me," Emma said. "Yes, Miss Voss." The woman's face was neutral, practiced. Her grace left instructions. "If you attended today, you were to be given it privately." Emma set down her teacup. "Of course," she said. "Lead the way." The study smelled like her. Emma noticed it the moment she stepped inside, a particular combination of wood smoke, old paper, and something floral but not sweet. Lavender, perhaps, or something older and drier than lavender. The smell of a room that had been lived in seriously, by someone who used it for actual work rather than appearances. The household staff member, a woman of middle age with a careful, composed face that suggested she had seen a great deal in this house, and intended to take none of it to her grave, closed the door behind Emma without being asked. Then she crossed to the desk, opened the top right drawer and removed an envelope. She held it out. "Her Grace sealed it herself," she said, 3 weeks ago. She was very specific about the instructions. Emma took it. Her name was on the front. Not Miss Voss, not Edmund's fiancée, not any of the titles or qualifiers that had been attached to her name since the engagement. Just Emma, written in a hand that was slightly unsteady, the hand of someone writing carefully despite discomfort, but absolutely legible, deliberate. The woman moved toward the door. "Take whatever time you need," she said. "I'll be just outside." Then she was gone, and Emma was alone in Margaret Ashford's study with an envelope in her hand, and the smell of lavender and old paper around her, and the distant sound of the reception carrying faintly through the walls. She sat in the chair beside the fireplace. The fire had been lit today, out of habit or respect. She wasn't sure which, and looked at the envelope for a moment. Then she opened it. The letter was 4 pages. The handwriting was Margaret's. She recognized it from a brief note she had received after her second visit to Ashford House. A formal thank you that had contained, at the bottom, one sentence that wasn't formal at all. "I hope you're paying attention. Most people don't bother." Emma had kept that note. She wasn't sure why. She kept it in the small box on her writing desk where she put things she didn't want to lose. She read the letter slowly. "My dear Emma, I am going to dispense with the usual niceties because I don't have the energy for them and you don't strike me as a woman who requires them. You came to see me when you didn't have to. You sat with me when sitting was all there was to offer. You asked about my roses and actually listened to the answer. These are not small things. They are, in my experience, quite rare. I want to tell you some things. I have debated telling you these things for several weeks because there is an argument to be made that they are not mine to tell. But I find at this particular stage of life that I am less interested in that argument than I once was. The truth is useful. Silence is often just cowardice wearing better clothes. First, Edmund. My son is a good man who has made a habit of choosing the comfortable thing over the honest thing for most of his adult life. I take some responsibility for this. His father was difficult, and Edmund learned early that the path of least resistance was the path that kept the peace. He has been keeping the peace ever since, with everyone, at considerable cost to himself and to others. You will have noticed this already. You notice things. He is capable of better. I have seen it. When his father died and Edmund was 12 years old and frightened and had no idea what he was supposed to do, he was better, clear and honest and genuinely himself. He lost that somewhere in the years between then and now, in the business of becoming a duke and meeting the right people and learning to manage everything from a safe distance. I have spent years trying to give it back to him. I have not entirely succeeded, but I have not entirely failed either. He needs to be shaken awake. I suspect you are capable of this. I suspect it is why I like you. Second, Vivienne Hartley, I will be direct. Vivienne has been part of Edmund's life for 11 years. I know what she is to him, or what she has been to him, which is not quite the same thing. I am not naive about this, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to you, because you deserve the truth and you probably already know most of it anyway. What Edmund does not know, what I have kept from him, and I will explain why in a moment, is this. 7 years ago, before Edmund inherited the title, when the family finances were in a complicated state following his father's death and the full weight of the estates had just come down on Edmund's shoulders, Vivienne went to Edmund's solicitor. Alone, without Edmund's knowledge. She represented herself in that meeting as Edmund's intended, which she was not. They had made each other no promises, and she obtained detailed information about the state of the Ashford finances, the debts, the mortgages, the precise situation. She used that information to approach 2 of Edmund's creditors independently. She negotiated on her own behalf to purchase those debts. She now holds them. Edmund does not know this. He believes those debts were settled years ago through estate management. They were not settled. They were bought. By the woman he considers a friend. By the woman who has positioned herself, carefully and patiently, for 11 years to be indispensable to him, while holding quietly the means to ruin him if he ever became inconvenient to her. I found out 4 years ago. I have kept it from Edmund because I was afraid of what he would do. Not that he would hurt her, Edmund is not that kind of man, but that he would blame himself. That the guilt of having been deceived so completely by someone he trusted would damage him in ways I could not repair. I thought I had time to find a better way to tell him. I ran out of time. That is why I am telling you. You are going to make a decision about whether to stay in this engagement or leave it. That decision is entirely yours, and I will not pretend otherwise. If you leave, I understand it completely. What has been asked of you is not small, and what you have been given in return is not enough. But if you stay, if you choose to stay, then you need to know what you are dealing with, and Edmund needs to know what he has been living with. The documentation is in this study. Bottom drawer of the desk behind the false back, press the left corner and it releases. There is a folder. Everything is there. The solicitor's records, the correspondence, the transfer documents. I have been holding them for 4 years. They are yours now. Do with them what you think is right. I have one last thing to say and then I will stop. You wore my son's name the moment this engagement was announced, and you have carried it with more dignity than he has earned. I watched you at dinner last month, the one in September, the first time Vivienne was cruel to you in front of people who should have stopped her and didn't. I watched your face. You did not flinch. You did not retaliate. You simply sat with it and processed it and moved on. I thought at the time, Either this woman is defeated or she is waiting. I watched you more carefully after that. You are waiting. Good. Whatever you decide, whether you fight or whether you walk away, do it on your own terms. Don't let anyone else set the terms for you. Not Edmund, not Vivienne, not your father, not the world's opinion of what a woman in your position ought to do. Your terms, Emma. That is all I wanted to say. With genuine affection and considerable admiration, Margaret Ashford Emma read the letter once. Then she sat for a long time without moving. The fire shifted, a log settling, a small collapse of embers, and the sound of it in the quiet room was very loud. She thought about Margaret Ashford writing this letter 3 weeks ago, writing it carefully, in an unsteady hand, 4 pages, knowing she would not be there to see what Emma did with it. Trusting Emma with something she had carried alone for 4 years because there was no one else she trusted to carry it correctly. She thought about the bottom drawer of the desk. She thought about Edmund at the podium this morning, his voice catching on the word honest. She thought about Vivienne's face when she had seen the dress. She thought about a great many things, sitting in that chair, while the fire burned down and the sound of the reception moved through the walls like the murmur of a tide coming in. Then she stood up. She crossed to the desk. She found the bottom drawer, pressed the left corner of the false back, and felt it release exactly as Margaret had described. The folder was there. She didn't open it. Not here, not now, not in this house with a reception happening 30 feet away. She simply took it, folded it carefully against her body beneath her coat, and stood for a moment in the middle of Margaret Ashford's study. Your terms, Emma. She looked around the room one last time, the books, the desk, the dying fire, the smell of lavender and paper, and a life lived seriously. Thank you, she said quietly to no one, to the room, to the woman who was no longer in it. Then she opened the door and walked back into the noise. 3 days passed. Emma used them well. She read every document in the folder twice, then a third time slowly with a pen in her hand and a piece of paper beside her on which she made notes in her small, precise handwriting. She was not a solicitor. She was not a financier. But she had grown up watching her father mismanage money with cheerful incompetence, which had taught her, by necessity, to understand how money actually worked. She could read a transfer document. She could follow a trail of correspondence. She could see, laid out in Margaret's careful folder, exactly what Vivienne had done and exactly how she had done it. It was, Emma had to admit, impressive. Not morally, not in any way she could admire, but as a feat of patience and calculation, it was genuinely impressive. 11 years. Vivienne had been building this for 11 years. Positioning herself close enough to be indispensable, far enough to maintain deniability, holding those debt documents like a card she never played because the threat of playing them was worth more than the playing. Edmund didn't know he was owned. He thought he was free. Emma closed the folder on the 3rd evening and sat with her hands flat on the table and thought about what kind of woman could do this to someone she claimed to love. She didn't reach a satisfying answer. She wasn't sure one existed. On the 4th day, Vivienne moved. Emma had expected something. She had not expected it quite so quickly. She had credited Vivienne with more patience than that. But perhaps the dress had rattled her more than Emma realized. Perhaps seeing Emma in that study, being handed that envelope, had accelerated something that was already in motion. Perhaps Vivienne had simply decided that waiting was no longer in her interest. Whatever the reason, it came on a Thursday afternoon. Edmund sent a note asking Emma to come to Ashford House at 4 o'clock. The note was brief and correct and gave no explanation for the request, which was unusual enough that Emma read it twice before setting it aside and going to change her dress. She arrived at 4 to find Edmund in the drawing room, standing by the fireplace, with the expression of a man who has been handed something unpleasant and is not yet sure what to do with it. Vivienne was not in the room. That was the first thing Emma noticed. "Thank you for coming," Edmund said. He gestured toward the chairs. "Please sit." Emma sat. Edmund did not sit. He remained standing by the fireplace, which told her something about his state of mind. Edmund sat when he was comfortable. He stood when he was managing something. I need to speak to you about something rather delicate, he said. Of course, said Emma. He paused. He looked at the fireplace. Then he looked at Emma with the expression of a man attempting fairness. I've been told something, he said, about you, about a situation. I want to give you the opportunity to respond before I form any opinion about it. Emma folded her hands in her lap. That's very reasonable of you. The information came to me from someone who expressed genuine concern. He paused on the word genuine in a way that suggested he was already not entirely comfortable with it. I was told that there has been correspondence between you and a gentleman, before the engagement but recent enough to be. He stopped. Emma waited. I was told, Edmund said carefully, that you have been meeting someone, privately, and that the meetings have continued since our engagement was announced. The room was very quiet. Emma looked at Edmund's face. She could see the discomfort in it. He did not want to be saying this, she could tell that much. He was a man who had been handed a story and had enough residual decency to feel uncertain about it, but not quite enough conviction to dismiss it outright. He was standing in the middle, which was, Emma had come to understand, Edmund's natural habitat. Who told you this? She asked. A flicker. I don't think Edmund. Her voice was quiet and entirely level. Who told you this? He looked at her for a moment. Vivienne, he said. Emma nodded slowly. Once. I see, she said. She said she felt it was her duty. I'm sure she did. The words came out with the faintest possible edge, just enough. She watched Edmund register it. Emma. Is it true? He asked. And now something had shifted in his voice, something less managed, something more direct. I'm asking you plainly. Is any part of it true? Emma looked at him. She thought about what she could say. She could deny it, which would be simple, because it was entirely false, invented from nothing. A story constructed specifically to create exactly this conversation in exactly this room. She could deny it and be believed, probably, because Edmund's decency would want to believe her. She could also, right now, open her coat, remove the folder, and end everything in this room in the next 10 minutes. She had thought about this moment for 3 days. She had turned it over until she knew every side of it. She did neither of those things. No, she said simply. It is not true. There is no gentleman. There has been no correspondence. There have been no private meetings. She held his gaze steadily. You may believe that or not as you choose. I won't perform distress to convince you. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. She couldn't quite read it. I believe you, he said. It came out sounding like it surprised him. Thank you, Emma said. Another silence. Edmund turned back to the fireplace. She was very specific, he said. Not accusatory, more like a man thinking aloud, puzzling at something. The details were, she made it sound very certain. People who invent things often are, Emma said. Vagueness is less convincing. Edmund turned. He looked at her, really looked at her, the same way he had looked at her at the funeral, that new quality of attention that had appeared 2 days ago and hadn't entirely disappeared since. Why would she do that? He said. And there it was. The question she had been waiting for. The crack in the wall, thin as a hairline, but there. Emma considered her answer very carefully. I don't know Vivienne's mind, she said. I can only tell you what I observe. She paused. She has been working very hard for quite some time to make me feel unwelcome. I have tried not to take it personally. I have not always succeeded. Edmund was very still. I didn't, he stopped, started again. I wasn't aware it had been that. I know, Emma said gently. I know you weren't. That landed somewhere. She could see it land. He had the look of a man beginning to realize that something has been happening in his own house, in his own life, in plain sight, and he has simply not been paying the right kind of attention. It was not a comfortable look. It was, Emma thought, possibly the beginning of something. But she was not going to do this for him. She was not going to lay it all out and hand it to him assembled and digested and easy to swallow. He was going to have to do some of this himself, or it would mean nothing. She stood. I should go, she said. You have a great deal to think about, and I imagine you'd prefer to do it without me in the room. He blinked. Emma. Edmund, she picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair. I am going to say one thing and then I'm going to leave, and I'd ask you to sit with it before you respond to it." He nodded. "The people who tell you the most certain stories," she said, "are often the people with the most to lose from your uncertainty. That's worth remembering." She pulled on her gloves. "Good evening," she said. "Thank you for telling me directly. That was the right thing to do." She left him standing at the fireplace. She walked through the entrance hall and out the front door and down the steps to her waiting carriage and sat down and looked at her hands for a moment. Her heart was beating faster than she would have liked, but her hands were perfectly steady. Vivienne had moved. The story was in Edmund's head now, false, denied, but in there nonetheless, doing whatever damage it was designed to do. Emma had perhaps 2 days before Vivienne tried something else, something more decisive, something that couldn't be answered with a quiet denial and a steady gaze. She looked out the carriage window at Ashford House receding behind her. She thought about the folder in her wardrobe at home. She thought about Margaret's voice, "Your terms, Emma." She was going to have to decide, not tomorrow, tonight. She didn't sleep. Not because she was distressed, or not only because of that. She didn't sleep because she had a decision to make, and she had never been able to make important decisions horizontally. She needed to be upright, awake, with a candle and a cup of tea gone cold, and the particular quality of silence that existed in London at 2 in the morning when the city had finally, briefly, stopped performing itself. She sat at her writing desk. The folder was in front of her. She had opened it again, not to read it, she had read it enough times to recite it, but to look at it, to sit with the physical fact of it. 4 years Margaret had carried this. 4 years of knowing what Vivienne was, what she had done, what she held over Edmund's life like a blade kept just out of sight. 4 years of protecting a son who didn't know he needed protecting, from a threat he couldn't see because he had never thought to look. And now it was Emma's. She could use it tomorrow. She had thought about exactly how it would go. She would request a meeting, Edmund, perhaps his solicitor if she wanted to be thorough. She would sit down across from them, and she would open the folder, and she would lay it out, piece by piece, with the quiet precision of someone who had read every document 3 times and understood every implication. She would watch Edmund's face as he understood what Vivienne had done. She would watch the 11 years of trust collapse in real time. Vivienne would be finished. Completely, permanently, socially finished, because this wasn't gossip, wasn't rumor, wasn't the kind of scandal that faded in a season. This was documentation. This was fraud committed against a duke. This was the kind of thing that followed a person to their grave. Edmund would be grateful. He would be shaken, guilty, suddenly and urgently aware of everything Emma had endured while he was not paying attention. The engagement would continue. Probably it would improve. Shock and guilt had a way of generating tenderness in men who were capable of tenderness, and Emma had decided, sitting at the funeral, that Edmund was capable of it. It was a clean solution. It was also, she had come to understand somewhere around midnight, not what she wanted. She picked up her pen, set it down again. The problem was this: if she showed Edmund that folder, she would win. But she would win on borrowed terms. She would be standing in front of him holding his mother's ammunition, firing his mother's gun, and whatever changed in Edmund afterward, whatever awakening occurred, whatever new attention he turned toward her, it would have been triggered not by Emma but by a dead woman's letter and a folder of documents. Emma would be the vehicle, not the reason, and she wanted to be the reason. Not out of pride, or not only out of pride, out of something more fundamental than that. She had spent her entire life being managed by other people's decisions, her father's debts, her family's name, the engagement her father had negotiated without asking her what she wanted. She had been moved from square to square on a board she hadn't chosen, by hands that weren't hers, and she had been good at it. She had been graceful about it, but she was 23 years old and she was finished. If Edmund Ashford was going to choose her, he was going to do it because he saw her, because he had looked, actually looked, and understood what was standing in front of him. Not because a folder of documents had removed his other options. She didn't want to be what remained after Vivienne was gone. She wanted to be what he chose. The distinction mattered enormously. She sat with this for a long time. Then she thought about the second part of the problem. Because there was a second part, and it was this. If she didn't use the folder, Vivienne would try again. The story about the gentleman had failed, Edmund hadn't believed it, had told Emma directly, had shown more spine in that conversation than she had seen from him in months. But Vivienne would not stop at one failure. She was too patient for that, too calculated. She would try something else, something more damaging. Something that might work better on a man whose trust was already fractured by grief and uncertainty, and the disorienting sense that things in his life were not what he'd believed them to be. Emma needed Vivienne to stop. She didn't need Edmund to stop her. She needed Vivienne to stop herself. She picked up her pen. She thought about what she knew about Vivienne, not what she felt about her. Feeling had no place at this desk at 2 in the morning, but what she actually knew. What she had observed with the careful, patient attention she had been applying for months. Vivienne was intelligent. Vivienne was controlled. Vivienne had spent 11 years managing a situation that required constant management, and she had done it well. She had not panicked. She had not overreached. She had moved in small, deliberate increments, never exposing more of herself than she had to, until the dress. The dress had been a mistake. Emma had recognized it at the time, and she recognized it now with more clarity. Sending the dress had been emotional. It had been the move of a woman who was rattled, who felt her position threatened, who had wanted to wound and had let that wanting override her usual calculation. It was the first mistake Vivienne had made in 11 years, which meant Vivienne was afraid, and afraid people made more mistakes. Emma thought about what afraid people feared most. They feared exposure. They feared the specific, particular terror of someone holding in their hands the thing that could end them, not using it, just holding it. The knowledge that it existed, that someone had it, that at any moment the choice could be made. She didn't need to show anyone the folder. She just needed Vivienne to know she had it. She began to write. The letter took 4 drafts. Each draft was shorter than the one before it, which was how Emma knew she was getting it right. The first draft was 3 pages, too much, too explaining, too much the letter of a woman who needed to justify herself. The second was 1.5 pages. The third was half a page. The fourth was 4 sentences. She read them over. Dear Miss Hartley, I have recently come into possession of some documents that I believe concern you. I have no present intention of discussing their contents with anyone. I trust this finds you well. Yours, Emma Voss. She read it a 5th time. It was, she decided, exactly right. It said everything it needed to say and nothing it didn't. It told Vivienne that Emma had the folder. It told her that Emma was choosing, for now, not to use it. It gave Vivienne the one thing that might actually make her stop. Not punishment, not exposure, but uncertainty. The permanent, unresolvable uncertainty of not knowing when, or whether, or under what circumstances Emma might change her mind. It was, in its quiet way, exactly what Vivienne had done to Edmund for 11 years. A blade kept just out of sight. Emma sealed the letter. She wrote Vivienne's name on the front in her clearest hand. Then she set it aside and looked at the folder. She was not going to show Edmund the folder. Not because he didn't deserve to know. He did, he absolutely did, and eventually he would need to know. But not like this. Not as a move in someone else's game. When Edmund found out about Vivienne's debt documents, it would be because Emma had decided the moment was right, and she would tell him herself, and she would do it as his equal. Not as a woman making a play. As a person telling another person the truth because the truth mattered. But that was not tonight's decision. Tonight's decision was made. She put the folder back in its place. She looked at the sealed letter on her desk. She looked at the clock. It was nearly 3 in the morning. She stood up, stretched her back, and went to stand at the window. London was quiet and dark and cold below her, the street lamps making small circles of yellow in the black. Somewhere far off a carriage was moving. Otherwise nothing. She thought about what Margaret had written. Whatever you decide, whether you fight or whether you walk away, do it on your own terms. She had decided to fight. But on her own terms, with her own tools, in her own time. She was not going to hand Edmund a solved problem and wait to be thanked for it. She was not going to let Vivienne maneuver her into spending the rest of her engagement defending herself against invented scandals. She was not going to be moved from square to square anymore. She was going to end the game, quietly, privately, with 4 sentences. And then she was going to do something she had been putting off for months. She was going to make Edmund Ashford actually know her. Not the Emma who was correct at dinners and composed at funerals and pleasant to everyone in all circumstances. Not the arrangement, the checkbox, the solved equation. Her. The woman who had read her mother's letters so many times the paper had softened at the folds. Who had managed her father's household accounts from the age of 17 because someone had to. Who had sat in Margaret Ashford's sick room and listened to a dying woman talk about roses for 40 minutes and found, to her surprise, that she hadn't wanted to leave. That Emma. If Edmund Ashford, given the chance to know that Emma, still chose the comfortable distance, still chose to manage everything from behind glass, still chose Vivienne or numbness or the path of least resistance, then she would have her answer, and she would leave, quietly, without drama, with her head up and her terms intact. But she was going to give him the chance first. That was her decision. She went to bed at 3:30 and slept for 5 hours deeply, without dreaming. In the morning she sent the letter. The response came in 2 days. Not a letter. Vivienne was too careful for a written response, too aware that paper was evidence. It came in the form of an absence, a quiet, complete, sudden withdrawal. A note sent to Edmund. Emma heard about it secondhand, through the particular efficient telegraph of household staff expressing regret that pressing family matters required Vivienne to retire to the country for the foreseeable future. No explanation, no timeline, no forwarding address offered, just gone. Edmund mentioned it to Emma at a brief afternoon call 2 days after the letter was sent. He stood at the window with a cup of tea and said, almost to himself, that Vivienne had gone to the country unexpectedly. "I see," said Emma. "She didn't say when she'd be back." "Perhaps she needed the rest," said Emma. "Grief affects people differently." Edmund looked at her. "Yes," he said slowly. "Perhaps." He looked at her for a moment longer with that new quality of attention, the one that had appeared at the funeral and seemed to be becoming a habit. "Emma," he said. "Yes." He seemed to be choosing his words. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Several, probably. I have not been as attentive as I ought to have been. As a fiancé, as a person. I think I have allowed myself to be comfortable where I should have been present, and I am sorry for it." Emma looked at him. It was not a grand speech. It was not eloquent. It was a little halting and slightly awkward and entirely genuine, the most genuine thing he had said to her since the engagement began. She felt something shift in her chest, the same shift she had felt at the funeral, but larger now. "Thank you," she said. "That means a great deal." "I'd like to," he stopped. "Started again. I'd like to start again, if you're willing, properly this time. I'd like to actually know you." Emma looked at Edmund Ashford standing at the window of his drawing room with his teacup and his careful, halting honesty and the look of a man who was trying, genuinely trying to be better than his habits. She thought, not yet. Not because she didn't want it, but because wanting was not the same as trusting, and trust was not built in an afternoon. "I think," she said carefully, "that would be worth attempting. Not yes, not no, a beginning." Edmund almost smiled. Outside, London was cold and grey, and the season was turning, the year folding over toward winter, and Emma Voss sat in a drawing room that was not yet hers and thought about what it might mean, eventually, to make it so. That evening she went home and took the folder from her wardrobe and put it in the locked box at the back of her writing desk. She kept the key on her person, just in case. The folder found him on a Sunday. Not through Emma, she had decided, and she held to that decision. When Edmund learned the truth about Vivienne, it would be because the truth had its own momentum, its own weight, its own way of surfacing eventually regardless of who was keeping it down. Emma had not planned for Sunday. She had not planned for any particular day. She had simply decided to wait, and to trust that waiting was not the same as doing nothing. What she had not accounted for was the solicitor. His name was Mr. Aldous Crane. He had served the Ashford family for 22 years, first the late Duke, then Edmund. He was a small, precise man with a particular quality of loyalty that comes not from affection but from professional pride. He had known about Vivienne's visit to his office 7 years ago. He had known, and he had been uncomfortable about it for 7 years, and he had said nothing because no one had asked, and because the Ashford family paid him well, and because he had told himself, in the way people tell themselves things they don't entirely believe, that it was not strictly his place. Margaret Ashford's death had apparently resolved his uncertainty. Emma learned this afterward, piecing it together from what Edmund told her, from what the household staff mentioned in passing, from the particular shape of events that only made sense once you knew how they connected. Crane had come to Ashford House on that Sunday morning with a file of estate documents requiring Edmund's attention following the Duchess's death. Standard business. The transfer of certain accounts, the updating of certain arrangements. Edmund had received him in the study, Margaret's study, which Edmund had begun using in the weeks since the funeral, which Emma thought said something about him that she filed away carefully. At the end of the meeting, when the formal business was concluded and Crane was gathering his papers, he had paused. He had said that there was one additional matter, a personal matter. He had said that he had long debated the correct course of action regarding certain information he possessed, and that the late Duchess's death had clarified his thinking, that he believed Edmund deserved to know, that he was, frankly, tired of knowing it himself, and then he had told Edmund about Vivienne's visit. He had not had documents with him, those were with Emma in a locked box, and Crane didn't know that. But he had his memory, which was precise and thorough, and he had his professional records, which documented the visit and its substance without documenting what Vivienne had done with the information afterward. It was enough. It was more than enough. Edmund sent for Emma that same afternoon. The note arrived at Kensington at 2:30. It was briefer than usual, the handwriting less controlled, the letters slightly uneven in a way she had never seen from him before. It said only, "Please come if you are able. I need to speak with you." She read it standing in the hallway. She told her maid to have the carriage brought round. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice. The house was quiet when she arrived, quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that settles over a place when the person in it has been very still for a very long time. She heard him in the way you hear a room that contains someone in distress, a particular quality of tension in the air, a feeling of something held. He was in the study. He was standing at the window when she entered, his back to the door, still in his morning coat, as though he had received Crane and then simply stayed where he was for the hours in between. There were papers on the desk, estate papers, she assumed, the legitimate ones Crane had brought. A glass of brandy untouched beside them. "Edmund," she said quietly. He turned. His face was different. Not destroyed, Edmund was too contained for destruction to show cleanly, but altered. The managed surface that he wore so habitually, the careful pleasant distance, was gone. What was underneath it was not what she had expected. It was not rage. It was not the hot, outward-facing anger of a man who had been deceived and wanted someone to blame. It was something quieter and more internal than that. He looked like a man who had been standing in a room he thought he knew and had just noticed that all the walls were in different places than he'd believed. Lost, that was the word, not dramatically, just quietly, genuinely, not quite sure which direction was which. "She came to Crane's office," he said, 7 years ago. She told him she was. He stopped, pressed his mouth together. She lied to him about what she was to me, and she got information she had no right to, and she used it too. He stopped again. "I know," Emma said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face. "You know." "Yes." The word sat between them. She watched him process it, watched him work backward through the implications. If Emma knew, then Emma had known for some time, which meant Emma had been carrying this while he had been standing in drawing rooms talking about Vivienne's sudden departure to the country, while he had been making halting apologies about not being present enough, while he had been, "How long," he said carefully, "have you known?" "Since the funeral," she said. "Your mother left me a letter." His breath went out of him, not loudly, almost silently. A slow release like air leaving a room through a crack under the door. She knew, he said, for 4 years. He turned back to the window. She let him stand there. She didn't fill the silence, didn't rush him, didn't offer comfort before he was ready for it. She had learned, watching him, that Edmund needed space to land. If you talked at him while he was still falling, he didn't hear you. She sat in the chair by the desk and waited. Outside, the garden was bare and pale in the winter light, the frost still on the ground even at this hour, the rose beds cut back to their thorns exactly as they had been the day of the funeral. After a while he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Not accusatory, genuinely asking. "Because it wasn't mine to tell," she said. "Not yet, not like that." He turned from the window. "You could have used it against Vivienne. Against whatever she was trying to do with that story she told me." "Yes," Emma said. "You chose not to." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he said. And here it was, the question underneath all the other questions, the one that mattered. Emma looked at Edmund Ashford standing in his dead mother's study with his brandy untouched, and his face stripped of its usual management, and she decided to be completely honest with him, possibly for the first time. "Because I didn't want to win that way," she said. "I didn't want to hand you a solved problem and wait to be thanked for it. I didn't want to be what remained after Vivienne was gone." She held his gaze steadily. "I wanted you to choose me because you saw me, not because you had no one else to choose." The room was very quiet. Edmund looked at her for a long time. She could see him actually looking, the new quality of attention, present since the funeral, deeper now than it had been then. She had the feeling of being genuinely seen, which was a feeling she had almost stopped expecting from this house, from this engagement, from any of this. "I've been remarkably stupid," he said. "Yes," Emma said, "you have." Something moved across his face. She thought it might have been the beginning of a smile, surprised out of him by her directness. "I've been standing at a distance from everything," he said, "my whole life. It seemed easier, safer. It was easier to manage things from a distance." He paused. "My mother told me this, repeatedly. I thought she was being her usual impossible self." "She was right," Emma said. "She usually was." His voice was quiet. "God, she was usually right." He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from Emma, which was the first time he had sat in her presence in this room. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, looking at his hands. The posture of a man who had set down something heavy and wasn't sure what to do without the weight of it. "I called on Vivienne this morning," he said. Emma went still. "Before I sent for you, I went to her house." He looked up. She was there. Apparently the country plans were premature. Emma said nothing. "I told her I knew," Edmund said. "About Crane, about the debts, about all of it." His jaw tightened briefly. She didn't deny it. "That was the thing. I don't know what I expected. Tears, perhaps, explanations. She just looked at me and said she'd done what she had to do and she'd do it again." He was quiet for a moment. "I believed her," he said. "That was the worst part of it. She meant it completely. Everything she did, she thought it was love. She thought ownership was the same thing as love." He shook his head slowly. "I told her I was ending all contact. She said I would regret it. I told her I already had enough regrets." Emma listened to this carefully. She thought about Vivienne. Not with triumph. She was surprised to find she felt very little triumph. Mostly she felt the particular exhaustion that comes after a long time of being careful, the loosening of muscles held too long in tension. "Are you all right?" she asked. Edmund looked up at her. The question seemed to surprise him, as though he hadn't expected it, as though being asked how he was rather than what he intended to do next was unfamiliar. "No," he said, "not particularly." A pause. "But I think I will be." She nodded. "Edmund," she said, "there's something else you should know." She stood, went to the writing desk, and opened the locked box she had placed there on her last visit. She had moved it here, she realized now, as if she had known. She removed the folder. She carried it across the room and held it out. He looked at it, then at her. "This is the documentation," she said. "Everything. The transfer records, the correspondence. Your mother kept it for 4 years. She held his gaze. It's yours. It always was. He took it slowly. He didn't open it. He just held it in both hands and looked at it. She trusted you with this, he said. She did. Why you, he said, not challenging, wondering. Why not? Why didn't she find a way to tell me herself? She was afraid you'd blame yourself, Emma said quietly. She thought the guilt would damage you. She paused. She was protecting you. Badly, perhaps, but that's what she was doing. Edmund closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were slightly brighter than before, the brightness of a man doing the work of not crying in front of someone he was only just beginning to know. She was a maddening woman, he said. She was extraordinary, Emma said. He looked at her. Yes, he said. She was. They sat in the study for a while after that, not talking particularly, just sitting in the shared silence of two people who have been through something together and are finding their way to the other side of it. The fire burned. The winter light moved slowly across the floor. At some point, Edmund poured the brandy out and rang for tea instead, which Emma thought was a reasonable decision. Outside, a blackbird landed on the frost-covered garden wall, looked around with quick bright eyes, and flew away. Edmund talked about his mother, not formally, not carefully, but in the wandering way of someone releasing grief in small pieces. Stories Emma hadn't heard. The time Margaret had told a visiting earl exactly what she thought of his politics, and then served him an impeccable dinner anyway. The roses she had cultivated for 30 years, crossing varieties herself, keeping notebooks about it. The way she had sat with Edmund's father through his long illness without complaint and without self-pity and had never once, not once, suggested that it was too much. Emma listened to all of it. She asked questions, real questions, the kind that required actual answers, not social questions designed to fill silence. She found herself genuinely interested, not performing interest, not managing the conversation, just actually wanting to know. Edmund noticed. She could tell he noticed because he kept looking at her mid-sentence with a slight expression of surprise, as though he expected her attention to drift and kept finding it hadn't. You're very easy to talk to, he said at one point, almost to himself. You've never tried before, Emma pointed out. He acknowledged this with a look that was part embarrassment and part something warmer. No, he said, I suppose I haven't. Evening was coming on by the time Emma stood to leave. The study had grown dim, the fire the brightest thing in the room, the winter dark pressing at the windows. Edmund walked her to the entrance hall. This was normal, he always walked her to the door, but it felt different tonight, less performed, less the correct behavior of a fiancé fulfilling his social function and more just a man walking beside a woman he was starting to understand he didn't want to stop talking to. At the door he said, Emma. She turned. He was standing in the entrance hall of Ashford House with the firelight behind him and the cold dark outside, and that new expression on his face. The open one, the one without the careful managed distance. I am going to be better at this, he said. I want you to know that. I'm not making promises about things I'm uncertain of, but that I'm certain of. Emma looked at him. She thought about the girl who had said yes to this engagement because what else was there to say? She thought about the woman who had hung a used mourning dress in her wardrobe and made a decision. She thought about Margaret Ashford writing 4 pages in an unsteady hand and trusting her with all of it. I know, she said, and she meant it. Not as capitulation, not as the relief of a woman who has been waiting to be saved, as the considered judgment of a person who had been paying close attention for months and had arrived on her own at a conclusion. She believed him. Edmund opened the door for her. The night air was cold and sharp and smelled of frost and London coal smoke. Her carriage waited at the bottom of the steps, the horses patient and steaming gently in the cold. She went down the steps. At the bottom she turned once briefly. Edmund was still standing in the doorway, still watching. She held his gaze for one moment. Then she got in the carriage and the door closed and the horses moved, and London swallowed her up in the dark. She sat back against the seat and breathed out slowly. The folder was in Edmund's hands. Vivienne was finished. Margaret's letter had done its work. The truth was where it belonged. And somewhere behind her, in a lit doorway, a man was standing in the cold watching her carriage disappear and beginning, finally, to understand what he had nearly lost. Emma closed her eyes. She slept all the way home. The cottage had been her idea. Not a romantic idea, a practical one. When Emma had left London in January, 2 weeks after that evening in the study, she had not left in anger. She had left in clarity, which was a different thing entirely and which Edmund, she suspected, had not immediately understood. She had written him a letter, 3 pages, which was long for her, but the occasion required it. She explained, as plainly as she knew how, that she believed him when he said he wanted to be better. She believed his intentions completely. What she was less certain of was whether intention was enough, whether Edmund Ashford, given the comfortable path, would actually take the harder one, or whether he would gradually, gently, with the best will in the world, drift back to the managed distance that had always served him so well. She wrote, "I cannot know this by staying. I can only know it by leaving and seeing what you do next." She wrote, "This is not a punishment. This is not a manipulation. This is me asking, in the only way I know how, for proof." She wrote, "I want to be chosen, deliberately, after consideration. Not by default, not by proximity, not because I am already there and it would be inconvenient for me not to be." She did not write, "I am frightened," but she was a little. She was 23 years old and she was breaking her own engagement and going to live in a cottage in Wiltshire on the small income she had been quietly managing from her father's remaining investments. Money she had grown, carefully, over 3 years without telling anyone because she had always suspected she might need it. She had been right about that too. She told her father at breakfast on the day she left. He took it better than she expected, which suggested he had seen more than she'd credited him for. He said only, "You know what you're doing, Emma. You always have." Then he asked for more toast. The cottage was outside Marlborough. Small, manageable, with a garden that had been neglected, and a fireplace that drew properly and windows that looked out over fields that went golden in the afternoon. She rented it from an elderly widow who asked no questions and charged a fair price and left Emma entirely alone. She was not lonely. This surprised her. She had expected loneliness, had braced for it, prepared for it, accepted it as the necessary cost of the decision she'd made. But what she found instead was something she hadn't felt in years, possibly ever. Quiet. Not the quiet of restraint, not the quiet of performing composure in rooms full of people waiting for her to slip. The quiet of a woman in her own space, accountable to no one, free to think her own thoughts at her own pace without managing anyone's impression of her. She read. She walked. She learned the names of the fields and the farmers who worked them and the widow's cat who appeared at her door each morning with the confidence of an animal that has decided you belong to it. She wrote letters to her father, to Mrs. Holt the dressmaker, and occasionally, carefully, to Edmund. He wrote back. That was the first thing. She had not known if he would. She had given him no instructions, no road map, no indication of what the correct response to her departure was. She had simply left and trusted him to decide for himself what it meant and what, if anything, he intended to do about it. His first letter arrived 11 days after she left London. It was 3 lines. "I understand what you're asking. I'm not sure I deserve the chance. I intend to try anyway. E." She read it twice, put it in the small box on her writing desk, and went to make tea. The letters continued. Once a week at first, then more frequently. They were not love letters, not in the conventional sense, not the flowery declarations she might have expected from a man in his position attempting to win back a woman he'd lost. They were better than that. They were honest. They were the letters of a man conducting, on paper, the examination of himself that he had spent his adult life avoiding. He wrote about his father, about learning, at 12 years old, that grief was something to be managed rather than felt, because feeling it made everything harder and managing it kept things running. About how that lesson had calcified over 20 years into a whole way of being. He wrote about Vivienne not defensively, not with the self-justification Emma might have expected. With clarity, he wrote, "I think I kept her close because she required nothing real from me. She wanted proximity and influence and what those things could give her. She never wanted to know me. I mistook that for safety. I understand now that it was the opposite." He wrote about his mother. Long letters about Margaret, the kind of letters a man writes when he is finally allowing himself to grieve. Emma read these slowly and carefully and felt, each time, the particular ache of someone being permitted to witness something real. She wrote back honestly. She wrote about her father and his cheerful financial ruin, and what it had taught her about the difference between love and management. She wrote about her mother, who had died when Emma was 14, and who had been, in Emma's memory, the last person who had seen her completely. She wrote about the cottage and the cat and the fields going golden and the strange, peaceful foreignness of a life that was entirely her own. She wrote once, "I did not know I was hungry until I stopped pretending I wasn't." Edmund wrote back, "I know exactly what you mean. I'm beginning to understand it myself." She kept all his letters in the box. The months moved. Spring came to Wiltshire with a thoroughness that felt almost aggressive after the long gray winter, everything green and loud and insistent. The garden exploding with things Emma hadn't planted because they'd been sleeping in the ground all along, waiting. She planted roses. She ordered 3 varieties from a nursery in Bath, chose them herself from a catalogue with the same care she had once applied to managing her father's accounts, and put them in with her own hands on a warm April morning. They were Margaret's varieties. She had looked them up, cross-referencing the names from Edmund's letters against the nursery catalogue until she found them. It had taken some patience. She did not tell Edmund about the roses. Some things were just for her. Summer came. Then autumn. The roses bloomed in June, and she stood in the garden looking at them for a long time, thinking about a woman she had known for 4 visits and a letter. In October, Edmund wrote, "I am coming to Wiltshire next month on a state business near Marlborough. I would like to call on you if you are willing. I will understand completely if you are not. E." Emma read this letter at the kitchen table with the cat on her lap and the morning light coming through the window and the garden outside going amber with the season. She sat with it for a day. Then she wrote back, "You may come. Thursday would suit." He arrived on a Thursday in November. Almost exactly 2 years to the week from the morning the box had arrived in the hallway of Ashford House. Emma did not know if he'd planned this or if it was simply how the calendar had fallen. She decided it didn't matter. She heard the carriage on the lane and went to the window. He looked different, not older exactly, or not only older, more present, more solidly himself, the way a man looks when he has been doing the difficult internal work, and it has changed something in his bearing. He was wearing a coat she didn't recognize and carrying his hat in his hand rather than on his head, which struck her as characteristic of something, though she couldn't have said what. He looked up at the cottage and saw her in the window. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just looked at her with the full, direct, entirely unmanaged attention that she had first seen at the funeral, and that had become, in his letters, his natural mode. She went to open the door. He was at the bottom of the front step when she opened it. He stopped there, hat in hand. The November air was cold and smelled of wood smoke and turned leaves. They looked at each other. 2 years of letters between them. 2 years of honesty conducted at a safe distance, and now the distance was gone and it was just the 2 of them on a Thursday morning in Wiltshire with everything said and nothing yet resolved. "You look well," he said. "You look different," she said. "Better or worse?" She considered him, the absence of the managed distance, the way he was standing fully present, not arranged, not performing correctness, as though he had decided that the performance was too expensive and had simply stopped paying for it. "Better," she said. He nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he'd been uncertain of. "I have things I want to say," he said. "I've written most of them down over the past 2 years. You have them. But I wanted to say some of them in person because I've been learning that there are things that require a room to exist in. They don't translate properly to paper. "All right," Emma said. "May I come in?" She stood back from the door. He came up the step and into the cottage, ducking slightly at the low doorframe, and stood in the small entrance hall looking around with an expression of genuine attention. The books on the shelf, the coat on the hook, the cat who appeared from the kitchen and regarded Edmund with the frank assessment of an animal who has decided it sets the terms of all introductions. Edmund looked at the cat. "Friend of yours," he said. "She owns the property," Emma said. "I merely rent it." Edmund crouched down and held out his hand. The cat approached, sniffed, considered, and then with the decisive air of a judge delivering a verdict, pressed her head briefly against his fingers. He looked up at Emma. "High praise," Emma said. "I'll take it." He stood. They went into the sitting room. Emma made tea because tea was what you did, and also because it gave her something to do with her hands while she adjusted to the reality of Edmund Ashford in her cottage, which was different from Edmund Ashford in a letter in a way she was still processing. He sat in the chair by the window. He didn't look around the room in the appraising way of a man noting what a woman's modest circumstances said about her reduced situation. He looked at it the way she had come to recognize as his real attention, with interest, with the specific curiosity of someone who wanted to understand rather than catalog. "You're happy here," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded. Something moved in his expression, not pain exactly. Recognition. "I'm glad," he said, and she believed him. She brought the tea. She sat across from him. The cat settled on the rug between them with the impartiality of a mediator. "All right," Emma said. "You said there were things you wanted to say in person." Edmund looked at her. He had, she knew, spent 2 years becoming a man who did not manage things from a distance. She could see the result of that work in how he sat forward, present, no glass between himself and whatever came next. "I love you," he said. "I want to be clear about that first before anything else, so that everything else I say happens inside that fact rather than building toward it." He paused. "I know that I had no business loving you when I first should have. I know that I was absent and I was careless, and I was in the habit of choosing the comfortable thing, and I chose it repeatedly at your expense. I'm not asking you to forgive that or to pretend it didn't happen." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm asking you for a chance," he said. "Not because you owe it to me. You don't. But because I think we both know that what is between us is worth attempting. The real version, not an arrangement, not a checkbox." He held her gaze. "You and me, and whatever we might actually be if we do this honestly." Emma held his gaze. She thought about a box arriving on a Tuesday morning, a worn black dress, 4 words on a card. She thought about a dying woman writing 4 pages in an unsteady hand, trusting her. She thought about 2 years in a cottage in Wiltshire, learning what it felt like to be entirely herself. She thought about the letters in the box on her writing desk, all of them, his handwriting becoming over 2 years increasingly itself, less formal, more direct, the handwriting of a man who had stopped performing and started simply being. She thought, this is the moment. Not a rescue, not a relief, not a woman accepting what was offered because nothing better was coming. A choice, her own, made freely on her own terms from a position of complete sufficiency. She didn't need Edmund Ashford. She wanted him. That was the difference. That was the whole thing, really. "You should know," she said, "that I am not going to be easy to manage. I'm not going to try," he said. "I have opinions about most things, I've gathered. I planted your mother's roses in the garden." He stopped. Something crossed his face, something she had never quite seen before, something open and unguarded and entirely undone. "Did you?" he said quietly. "June, they bloomed well for the first year." She paused. "I thought she'd like to know someone was still paying attention." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the small table between them and held out his hand, palm up, unhurried, not taking, offering. Emma looked at his hand, she looked at his face, she put her hand in his. The cat shifted on the rug. Outside, the November wind moved through the garden, and the roses, cut back now for winter, thorns and bare canes, stood in their beds, patient, waiting for spring. "Well," said Emma Voss. Well, said Edmund Ashford. And in the warm, quiet sitting room of a small cottage in Wiltshire, on a Thursday morning in November, 2 years after a box arrived with no ribbon and no name, something that had been broken for a long time was quietly, finally, put right. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this Duke story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks super chat. Your support truly helps us continue bringing these stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.